In 1968, architecture students in Paris read an article published in the magazine Domus about an obscure Irish designer who'd worked in France 40 years prior and since been forgotten. Based on nothing more than the grainy photos, they went to find her, and they found her in the phone book, a line on a page, Gray, Eileen, Rue de Bonaparte. The students knocked on her door and asked for her help with their architecture homework, because that's what you need when you're a student. And Eileen, 94 years old at the time, said yes. Now, for so long, there was a mystery surrounding Eileen, already a renowned furniture designer by the late 1910s, then a rising star in the architecture world of the 1920s, an early member of SIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architecture, creator of one of the best buildings in the international style, personal acquaintances with Le Corbusier himself, and then it all just stopped. If Eileen really was just a one-hit wonder of the 1920s, what was so impressive about the Domus article? Here we go. Eileen was working at a time when the entire world was in flux. It wasn't just the political world after World War I. Every single aspect of life was changing. It's so hard for us to understand now, but design of all kinds was at the forefront of this new world. The world of architecture was particularly consumed by Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, published first in France and then in English. It called for buildings and houses to become a machine for living and to follow his 5 points of architecture. All 5 of these points were developed trying to fix the problems of the Great War. Hygiene, illness, battlefield hospitals, doctors and nurses in long and cumbersome clothing, mud and dirt and horses everywhere. So Corbusier's 5 points used flat white surfaces, sunlight and fresh moving air, outdoor exposure, plants, simple interiors. To us now, it is clearly PTSD from the war, but to them it was a social movement to create a formula that would guarantee a lack of horror in the world. They couched it in science, in psychology, in engineering, in cleanliness and manufacturing lines and machines that would create a perfect life for everyone, from the proletariat up to the aristocrats. Houses and buildings and furniture would make people be happy, be civilized, be healthy, be equal. Everyone would have streamlined walls and floors and doors and windows and chairs and tables and beds. They would all be perfect. They would have perfect lives and well-behaved children, and nobody would die from tuberculosis. This was the sort of thing being produced by the modern movement. The exteriors were great, but the interiors not so much. And the problem with this sort of thing is it isn't warm and welcoming and inviting. Who wants to live here? Eileen's work came to prominence with this project. She had her own design firm in Paris, specializing in custom furniture that she herself made, which was a very unusual career choice for an aristocratic Irish debutante. Her design sensibility was immediately recognized for what it was, a fusion of the cold and sterile international style with warmth and sensuality. What set Eileen apart from the rest was her ability to infuse her pieces with a softness and elegance that other designers of the modern style just didn't have. If you compare this to other interiors of the time, it's striking how welcoming it is. And even through century-old black and white photograph, you can almost feel the texture of the lounge chair and the blanket, the quality of the sunlight bouncing around the walls, resting on the furniture. It was a hit. It got published in Harper's Bazaar, and it got Eileen the attention she deserved. Act 2. Eileen's boyfriend, the architectural writer Jean Badovici, agreed with the accolades. He said to her, "It's so silly, all this trouble with furniture. And what's furniture after all? It's so trivial. Why don't you do some architecture?" He suggested that he and Eileen design a vacation home together. Jean was close friends with Le Corbusier, so of course they'd follow his 5 points of architecture in their new home. They found a nice plot of land in the south of France on the Riviera, and Eileen started designing. She moved down to the site to work on the design and guide the builders, and Jean would come down on the weekends to join. Girl, seriously. The land had to be purchased only in Jean's name for legal reasons, but if you're in the sort of relationship where you're building a vacation home together from scratch, you're not worried about breaking up or dividing up assets. Girl, like, seriously. When it was complete, E1027, as Eileen named it, was another big hit. Jean published a special edition about it in his magazine, L'Architecture Vivante, which everyone who was anyone had a subscription to. And it wasn't just, it was a perfect modern masterpiece following Corbusier's principles. It was Eileen's use of space and light and custom furniture designed just for the villa that made the space so airy and effortless. She humanized the international style. Her inclusion of organic touches and the connection to nature, it softened the machine for living and turned it into a home. As she herself said, the poverty of modern architecture stems from the atrophy of sensuality. That was supposed to be English or whatever. Okay, forget the accents. So, a black and white photo, can that really do it justice? I think we should look at it in color. So, I'd live here, right? It's small, but it flows so nicely. You can lounge about in the natural light. Everything's open to the living space. You can chat with your friends. You can hang out with them. She considered the path of the sun through the seasons, the changing winds, the view. You're on the Riviera. None of that was in the 5 points of architecture. So imagine you get up in the morning, you sit in her comfy bibendum chair, which was modeled on the Michelin Man. You have coffee on the veranda. That's not a joke. You have coffee on the veranda. You just watch the ocean. All of the furniture was also a big hit. My personal favorite is this one, the E1027 table, which she designed for her sister so that when the sister visited, she wouldn't get crumbs everywhere when she ate crackers in bed. Like, I can only aspire to such a level of design genius, right? When Eileen and Jean split up in 1931, she had no legal claim to the villa. On paper, it all belonged to him. Girl, like, why? Okay, so he kept the villa, and he would regularly invite Corbu over. So Corbu was on the forefront of a design movement that he had spearheaded. Imagine being him. You're Le Corbusier. You're at the peak of your professional life. You have created a new movement that's obliterated everything that came before it. You are world famous. And then your buddy's girlfriend, who's not even an architect, follows your book and your principles, and on her very first try creates a wholly modern house that even you have to admit is better than yours. She does not even bâtonner, and she creates a masterpiece. As historians agree, Le Corbusier was jealous of Eileen Gray for damn good reason. In 1938 and 1939, while staying at the villa on various visits to Jean, Corbu painted these large murals on the walls. In 2013, the critic Rowan Moore, writing in The Observer, called it, and I quote, "an act of naked phallocracy by a man asserting his dominion like a urinating dog over the territory." And to be clear, this is not hyperbole. Le Corbusier was quoted as saying about these very murals on these very walls, "I admit the mural is not to enhance the wall, but on the contrary, a means to violently destroy it." So if we look again at the color photos of the villa, it's obvious the murals don't fit. They don't fit in style, they don't fit in scale, they don't fit in color. And Le Corbusier didn't just deface Eileen's villa, like so many women who were architects or designers at this point in time. He and the other men just left her out of the history of what had happened. When Jean died unexpectedly young in 1956, the villa was attributed at his memorial exhibition as the work of Jean Badovici with the collaboration of Eileen Gray for the furniture. And Corbu, who could have corrected the misattribution of Eileen's work but didn't bother to, bought the plot of land next door 4 years later and built himself a small cabin that literally overshadowed hers. And after that, the villa was attributed to Corbu himself, not Eileen. Eileen also didn't help herself as she turned down all invites to participate in any sort of exhibitions. And after 15 years of this, folks finally stopped inviting her to participate. Like, how many times can you reach out to somebody before you just give up, right? And then it gets worse. E1027, the physical manifestation of Eileen and Jean's love, went through hard times. The Nazis used it for target practice due to the degenerate murals. Then came fraud, orgies, drugs, a murder in the living room, and squatters, all of which will be its own talk. I don't have room for it. Efforts to save the villa didn't really start until 1999, utilizing the French government's classification of the villa as a monument historique, and it continued all the way through 2021. As one of the first steps taken by the French government, the attribution of the villa was updated from Le Corbusier to Jean Badovici. But why had the government made this a historical monument? I'm glad you asked. In 1965, a man named Joseph Reichert went to a party in London, and at the party, he was telling his friend, the painter Prunella Clos, how much he loved the murals of Le Corbusier. And Prunella asked him why, if he liked the murals so much, he hadn't written anything about the villa they were painted in. Since the villa had been designed by Prunella's aunt Eileen, she could put Joe in touch with her in Paris. And from that one fateful conversation, the ball begins to roll. Joseph wrote the article that was published in Domus in 1967, the architecture student's founder, and so did a man named Ze'ev Aram, who ran a furniture company, and he had to work very hard to convince Eileen to license his company to reproduce her work. And word begins to spread in the design world. In 1972, Eileen was appointed a royal designer for industry and ran an exhibit, and an exhibit of her events was put on at the Royal Institute of British Architects Gallery in London. At auction in Paris that year, a young up-and-coming fashion designer bought the only copy of the dragon armchair that Eileen had made for that apartment that I showed at the beginning. He bought it for the equivalent of $1 million, which made the news and definitely increased public awareness of Eileen. But if you think about it, it's an absolutely remarkable occurrence. To go from complete obscurity to internationally famous in 5 short years based off old work is unheard of. Her work was so astounding that 40 years later, it still galvanized professional groups to throw all their power to bring her into the spotlight. This story I'm telling takes up so much time, I can't explain how much farther ahead she was than everybody else, but it took 40 years for the world to catch up to her. Eileen died 3 years after the Domus article was published at age 98, aware of the growing interest in her work, but never dreaming of what would come afterwards. E1027 has since been completely restored and filled with reproductions of her original works, and you can visit it today. Le Corbusier retired here, and he died here. Every single day that he spent in his house, he spent it staring at hers. What an absolute nut job. Eileen's furniture is still in production, and the originals are almost priceless. Did I say almost? Do you remember that chair bought by the young fashion designer? So he was Yves Saint Laurent, and after he died in 2009, his art collection, including the dragon chair, was sold at auction. It was assumed beforehand that the chair would make 2,000, maybe 3,000 euros. You know, pretty good, right? The winning bid was 21.9 million euros, making it the most expensive chair and the second most expensive piece of household furniture ever sold in the entire history of the world. Yes. Chairs, yes. So, chairs. You may not know Eileen Gray's name, but you are constantly surrounded by the traces of her work. Every time you walk into a building built in the past 100 years, and you feel comforted by its coexistence with natural light and air, its idiosyncratic furniture, its organic and textured surfaces, or its use of harmonious color, even its rugs, you are in an Eileen Gray space. Yep, that's her. Eileen took the incredibly traumatized response to World War I, and she used her dexterity and her skill to turn it into the kind of places that people want to be in. Everyone who saw her spaces copied her gestures, her sensuality, her connection to nature, and because of her influence, we have homes and not machines. As she herself said, a house is not a machine for living. It is a shell of a man, his extension, his release, his spiritual emanation. Not only its visual harmony, but its organization as a whole, the whole work combined together, makes it human in the most profound sense. So, please join me in raising a glass to Eileen Gray, the woman who transformed modernism into life. It brings me great pleasure to share her with you so that you too can see her everywhere you look.